Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Now, in this episode, we're diving into the intriguing and somewhat alarming political shifts happening in Georgia. The countries lie at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, and in a more metaphorical sense, it is also caught between the East and the West. Georgians are a nation with a rich history and a complicated geopolitical landscape. It is currently in the throes of a significant political transformation that could redefine its future. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
The decision by Washington and Brussels to re-evaluate their relationship with Tbilisi came after the Georgian government decided to adopt the controversial foreign agent law. The legislation requires media groups and non-governmental and non-profit organizations that receive more than 20% of their funding to register as pursuing the interests of a foreign power. Prior to the bill's adoption, which required the parliament to override a presidential veto, thousands of Georgians poured into the streets of major cities to protest the bill's signing into law. However, no matter how loudly they chanted, the minds of Georgian MPs could not be changed. Opponents of the bill say it's a way to stifle dissent and limit the freedom of speech of independent media. Analysts have also compared the bill to a similar one in Russia, which is being used for these very purposes. Now the Georgian people will have to pay for their government's decision. In addition to halting the country's accession process, the EU has also decided to freeze its financial support package worth some 13 million euros, which was intended to strengthen Georgia's defenses. As for the US, after denouncing the decision to implement the bill, Washington decided to suspend its military cooperation with Tbilisi. The move also calls into question Georgia's aspirations to join NATO.
And now let's take a look at this issue in greater detail. Recently, Georgia has been making headlines for all the wrong reasons. The government's push for a controversial foreign influence bill, reminiscent of a Russian legislation by the similar name, has sparked widespread protests and international concern. We've covered this before, so to keep it brief, this bill would require any organization receiving more than 20% of its funding from abroad to register to be under the influence of foreign interest. Critics argue that this move is a blatant attempt to stifle dissent and curb the influence of Western-backed NGOs and media. It's a classic case of let's borrow from the authoritarian playbook next door. Now, Georgia has long been seen as a pro-Western country, aspiring for EU and NATO membership. So, why the change of heart? Well, the answer lies in a mix of internal and external factors. Internally, the ruling Georgian Dream Party, founded by the billionaire Bedzida Ivanishvili, is grappling with declining popularity and growing opposition. By adopting a more nationalist and conservative stance, it seeks to consolidate power and appeal to a population skeptical of Western liberal values. Externally, the situation is even more complex. Russia, Georgia's northern neighbor, has always viewed the country as part of a sphere of influence. Since the 2008 war, Russia has occupied 20% of Georgian territory, and relations between the two countries have been tense at best. The introduction of this foreign influence bill can be seen as a nod to Moscow, signaling a shift away from the West and towards a more Russian-aligned stance. This move has not gone unnoticed by Kremlin, which has been quick to praise Georgia's sovereign approach to foreign interference. But this isn't just about pleasing Putin. It is also about sending a message to the EU and the US that Georgia's government is essentially saying, we don't need your approval and we don't need your money. This anti-Western pivot is risky, especially considering that a majority of Georgians still support EU membership. A recent poll showed that 83% of the population favors joining the EU and 78% want to become a part of NATO. Now, these numbers highlight a significant disconnect between the government's action and the will of the people. The backlash was swift and fierce. Thousands of Georgians took to the streets of Tbilisi to protest against the foreign influence bill. The demonstrations quickly turned hot, with clashes between protesters and police resulting in dozens of injuries and arrests. The images have drawn comparison to the early days of Ukraine's Euromaidan movement. Internationally, the response has been equally critical. The European Union has warned Georgia that passing the bill would jeopardize its membership aspirations. Despite the pressure, Georgian Dream seems undeterred, accusing foreign-funded organizations of meddling in Georgian politics and undermining sovereignty. It's a narrative that resonates with those who feel left behind by globalization and wary of foreign influence. Georgia is at a critical juncture. On the one hand, the government action could lead to further isolation from the West. On the other, there is a growing movement within Georgia demanding a return to the principles of the West. The outcome of this struggle will have profound implications, not only for Georgia, but for the entire region. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Victor Kipriani, a chairman of GeoCase.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
So right now we are looking at the latest development in Georgia. We do know that the aspiration of joining the EU seems to be meeting a hurdle. Can you help us break that down a little bit and what happened there?
Well, the recent developments that the integration developments with EU, they came to a standstill. That been acknowledged by the EU ambassador to Georgia recently. And that also entailed suspending various EU-related programs and specially designated projects. And some suspensions would be in the pipeline and quite likely would undergo the same fate. It is also important to underline that our partners in EU are expecting the parliamentary elections in October this year. And my understanding that until and unless an environment in Georgia, domestic political environment, would not be changed towards the resuming the robust pro-EU integration, there should not be expected any changes in that respect. So we're heading to the elections, and the elections will define at the juncture of the history further developments down the road.
Right, it is a very pivotal juncture indeed. We're looking at a tug of war between the East and the West, Georgia's aspiration to the Western world or to Russia. However, do you think this at this very critical time, will the halt in diplomatic affairs, the pulling of funding, and even U.S. Saying that they're going to pull some defense, is actually going to help drive Georgia into the hands of Russia?
An obvious thing that all mainstream political parties in Georgia, they still advocate for a pro-EU integration path, including the ruling party called Georgian Dream. So we don't hear any denials in that respect. More than that, it looks like that at least on the face value, every political camp, every political party, as it competes with each other in terms of declaring its dedication to the EU integration. However, in case of the ruling party, of course, those statements and those declarations come at odds, I was speaking, with certain actions. Those actions being different legislations which have been enacted on the Georgian side, which are not quite reconcilable, to put it mildly, with EU agenda. And that's been stated by EU officials on a number of instances. Nevertheless, Georgian Dream is committed, in a way, to pursue the same course, which probably would be pulling Georgia apart from the EU-related agenda. But when we speak about Georgia being away from EU, we should not overlook the public sentiments on the ground. And that probably what gives us a hope that there would be a reversal eventually to the EU trajectory. Also, we don't have to overlook a very robust and vigorous support by EU partners. So all in all, putting the bets on those two pressure points, which is by the civic society and the Georgian public in overall, at a very grassroots level, and by EU institutions, EU member nations, eventually an end result would be positive. But again, very much, too much depends on the parliamentary elections. that would be really a defining point in Georgian history, including Georgia-EU relations.
Right, thanks for stressing how important and pivotal this upcoming election will be. And with that in mind, I would also like to ask you about the grassroots movement and the general kind of atmosphere on the ground that you're witnessing. Of course, we here looking from afar tend to want to see this as a overwhelming support for the direction to the west. But over there in Georgia, what do you think the voter sentiment actually is?
Well, actually, it's a critical challenge. Of course, we speak about the public sentiments on the ground, but we don't have to forget that Georgian Dream has its own base support of voters, which is considerable enough. And that is very much added by the hybrid warfare, which is in a full swing. And the disinformation campaign, of course, contributing to getting more support for anti-EU, anti-Western propaganda in Georgia. The second challenge, which I have to point out necessarily, it's still a fragmented Georgian opposition. And I've been keeping saying that in these circumstances, unwillingly for the opposition, of course, and the best ally for Georgian Dream is an opposition itself. So hopefully we have to expect more consolidation in rank and file of Georgian opposition, which would eventually and ultimately translate into substantial gains and substantial results as a result of the parliamentary elections. So those two challenges are quite on the surface, and each of them has to be dealt with in its own and, I would say, very unique manner.
Can you help us shed some light on the reason why the opposition isn't gaining as much support as probably needed?
Well, they do have a support, but again, the specifics of the Georgian electoral legislation and also multiplicity, I would say, of different political parties, which are still failing to find a common language. And you would agree with me that even though having a wide public support, any type of public support has to be eventually translated into actual number of seats. And coupled with specifics and peculiarities of the Georgian electoral code, if that combination, if that synergy, if that unity is not achieved, then the public sentiments, even if being quite widespread and broad enough at a grassroots level, would be dissipated and would not crystallize into substantial gains. So I very much rely and very much hope that as these elections have been called as and termed as the referendum, those would not be just an ordinary elections. And the essence of the referendum that the elections, and by definition the referendum, have to define the fate of the Georgian foreign policy, the agenda. Those political camps and political parties would take into consideration to a full extent all the responsibility which is on their shoulders, and would eventually come and reach to the only the logical the combination, which is, as I've said, as much unity. When I say much unity, we still expect there would be several electoral centers which would be running for the parliamentary seats. Two of them have already been formed up, which primarily are the outfits of the United National Movement. But another formation which still has to come up is expected to be combined or to be formed up by political parties which are not related to the United National Movement. And when I'm emphasizing United National Movement, it still rings a bell of that very negative legacy. And many voters and opposition voters are still quite aware of that legacy. So they're very much looking forward to combine their efforts as voters around a political camp or political camps which are still consolidated enough, but are not related with UNM. So those are the sort of objectives which have to be sorted out by end of the summer, because, election campaign has its own requirements and has to be put into action.
Like you mentioned, the Georgian opposition, or there's actually grassroots movement and widespread sentiment against the Georgian Dream Party. However, the opposition is pulled in many different ways and still need to be consolidated in order to win this upcoming quote-unquote referendum. Do you think that 3 months is enough time to get it together? Or actually, when you look at the politics in France, for example, they were able to consolidate and work something out with some political horse trading in just a span of a week. 3 months, do you think it's enough time?
Well, that's exactly the cause of the dissatisfaction among the Georgian society, that the opposition parties have not yet reached that very required consensus. So time is running, time is of essence. And the waste of time plays into the hands of the Georgian dream. So again, my sincere hope that those internal discussions or consultations in the camp of the Georgian opposition would be completed in the coming weeks, so the opposition plunges itself into the campaign itself.
All right, thank you so much for your input and insight and helping us unpack this relatively complicated situation. But thanks again for being with us on Eastern Express.
Pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. According to a diplomatic source, Greece is preparing to hand over 32 decommissioned F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. This news comes ahead of the delivery of 24 of the same planes by Denmark and the Netherlands, expected to arrive in Ukraine in the coming months.
The decision to transfer such an impressive number of F-16 jets to Ukraine reportedly follows Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis' trip to Odessa in March 2024. The city was struck by Russian missiles during the visit, leading to a major shift in public perception of the war in Ukraine among the Greek population. Since February 2022, favorable views of Russia and Greece have dropped from 70% to around 30%. In light of this news, Russia feels pressured to do something before the jets arrive in Ukraine and are able to take to the skies. Fors, a Russian supplier of ceramic propellant for oil towers, has announced a bounty of around $170,000 for the first destruction of a Western-supplied F-16 in Ukraine. This isn't the first time the company has done so, having offered bounties of up to $56,000 for the destruction of Leopard and Abrams tanks.
At least 650,000 Russians have fled to other countries and have not returned following Moscow's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. While this number may seem high, it is still an underestimation, given that some countries have not shared their immigration data.
The Bell, an independent business news outlet, published a report on Tuesday. According to the report, a mass exodus from Russia happened in two waves, the first one being the start of the war in Ukraine. The second wave was brought about by the partial military mobilization introduced by Vladimir Putin in the early stages of the war. The top destinations for Russian defectors are Armenia, Kazakhstan and Georgia, who have visa-free entry for Russian citizens. Following them, the US, Israel and Germany. During the first wave of the Russian exodus, Putin called those who left the country scum and traitors, but has since backtracked. Now the Russian president refers to those who choose to avoid the war in Ukraine and remain abroad as an additional element connecting Russia with its foreign partners.
Former governor of the autonomous region of Gagauzia in Moldova, Irina Vla, has announced that she will be running for president of Moldova. In the past, she has been criticized for her alignment with pro-Russian views.
Irina Vlach, known for condemning the current Moldovan government's close ties with NATO, announced her candidacy on Wednesday. She's also voiced her disapproval of the country's increased defense spending in recent years. As for her political background, she has served as the governor of the autonomous region of Gagauzia, which is home to some 140,000 people, mostly ethnic Turks. While her candidacy is worrying for pro-Western Moldovans, she is expected to secure only around 4% of the vote in the first round of the election. The favorite to win the vote is incumbent Maia Sandu, who's been a proponent of integrating Moldova into Western organizations, including NATO and the EU. Maia Sandu's government has also joined other Western countries in imposing sanctions on Russia and Belarus following the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine.
That they wanted us to fulfill.
As part of its Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing is looking to invest in two of the poorest countries in Central Asia, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Now, this comes after a significant pause in Chinese investment into the two countries.
By far the largest investments in the infrastructure of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan is the CKU railway, which will connect Central Asian countries with China. The section of the railway that would go through the two countries is estimated to cost between $4.5 to $8 billion. Earlier this year, the president of Kyrgyzstan announced that construction of this section of the railway is scheduled to begin in October this year. Other projects that have been announced include real estate, bridges, tunnels and both solar and hydroelectric power plants. The construction of new power plants is especially important given how often both countries experience power outages. Western onlookers have also warned of the excessive debt that often accompanies Belt and Road projects.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.